The moment Judge Gregory Harrow dismissed Elijah Carter's case without a second glance, he sealed the fate of every corrupt power broker in Baltimore. They thought they saw the whole story. A defeated 75-year-old black man, another elderly holdout, forced off land his family had owned since Reconstruction. Just one more victory in their decades-long campaign to erase generations of black wealth through perfectly legal theft. What they never saw was Ruth Carter's final masterpiece, orchestrated from her deathbed 18 months earlier. Every dismissed case, every forged document, every bribed official, all carefully documented in her precise handwriting. They never understood that her quiet husband, standing before them with her photograph clutched to his chest, wasn't there to beg for justice. He was there to spring the trap that would expose their entire corrupt empire. Ruth Carter died fighting cancer. But she left behind a weapon more powerful than any corporate lawyer or crooked judge. The truth, preserved by love, protected by patience, and about to be wielded by those they'd underestimated for far too long. Sometimes the most devastating battles are won in whispers, and Baltimore's most powerful men are about to learn why Ruth Carter's name will echo long after their empires crumble to dust. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The wooden bench creaked beneath Elijah Carter as he shifted his weight, trying to find comfort in the unforgiving courthouse seat. His weathered hands trembled slightly as they held the silver-framed photograph of Ruth, his beloved wife of 50 years. The image captured her radiant smile from their last anniversary together, before cancer took her away 18 months ago. "Give me strength, Ruth," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling papers and quiet murmurs filling courtroom 307. "Just like you always did." At 75, Elijah's tall frame had begun to bow under the weight of years and worries, but his eyes remained sharp and clear behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore his best suit, navy blue, pressed the night before, and a tie Ruth had given him years ago. His white hair was neatly combed, and his worn shoes were polished to a shine. Even now, he believed in presenting himself with dignity, just as his parents had taught him. The courthouse buzzed with activity around him. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past, briefcases swinging. Court officers directed traffic through security checkpoints, and the click-clack of heels echoed off the marble floors. Among the crowd, a young woman with a reporter's notebook caught Elijah's eye. She seemed different from the others, watching the proceedings with genuine interest rather than detached professionalism. Maya Henderson adjusted her press badge and settled into her seat, pen poised above her notebook. At 28, she was one of the youngest reporters covering the courthouse beat, and unlike many of her colleagues who chased sensational stories, she found herself drawn to the quieter cases, the ones that revealed the true character of justice in America. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "The Honorable Judge Gregory Harrow presiding." Judge Harrow swept into the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him. He was a man in his early 60s with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to dismiss people before they even spoke. He settled into his chair with the confidence of someone who knew his word was law within these walls. "Carter versus Riverside Development Corporation," the clerk announced. "Civil case number 2025 CV 4789. Elijah rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement. The young public defender beside him, fresh out of law school and already overwhelmed with cases, shuffled through his papers nervously. "Your Honor," the public defender began, "Mr. Carter is here today to present evidence regarding the wrongful foreclosure of his family's property." "Approach the podium, Mr. Carter," Judge Harrow interrupted, barely glancing at the file before him. Elijah made his way forward, still clutching Ruth's photograph. The walk felt longer than it should have, each step echoing in his ears. He could feel the weight of the courthouse's indifference pressing down on him. "Your Honor," Elijah began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "my family has worked that land for generations. My great-grandfather, a freed slave, purchased those 40 acres in 1867. He paid for every inch with money he earned through his own sweat and determination. The judge's expression remained impassive, but Elijah continued, drawing strength from Ruth's image. "We have the original deed, Your Honor. My wife, Ruth, she kept all our family papers organized in—" "Mr. Carter," Judge Harrow cut in, a hint of condescension in his tone. "Are you aware that property tax laws have changed significantly since 1867? Yes, Your Honor, but the taxes were paid. We have receipts. Outdated documents from a different era hardly constitute relevant evidence in a modern court proceeding." The judge's voice dripped with dismissal. "The current deed and tax records clearly show—" "But sir, those records were falsified." Elijah's voice rose slightly, earning a sharp look from the judge. "If you'll just look at the documentation my wife saved—" "Mr. Carter." Judge Harrow's tone could have frozen water. "This court's time is valuable. The foreclosure was legally executed according to current statutes. Your historical grievances, while unfortunate, have no bearing on the present situation." Maya's pen moved furiously across her notebook, capturing every word, every dismissive gesture. Her jaw clenched as she watched the scene unfold. In the gallery, whispers began to circulate. "These people always want handouts," one woman muttered to her companion. "Wasting everyone's time with ancient history," another added, not bothering to lower his voice. Elijah stood straight, dignity intact despite the murmurs. "Your Honor, please. That land represents everything my family built. My wife Ruth, before she passed, she made me promise—" "Case dismissed." Judge Harrow's gavel crashed down with finality. "Bailiff, please ensure Mr. Carter is escorted out, if he continues to disturb the court's proceedings." The young public defender slumped in defeat, already reaching for his next case file. Elijah remained at the podium for a moment, the weight of generations of hopes and dreams crashing down around him. As he turned to leave, the crowd parted around him like water around a stone, eyes averted, no one willing to acknowledge the injustice they had just witnessed. Maya Henderson watched him go, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote her final notes. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air carried a bitter chill. Elijah sat heavily on a stone bench, still holding Ruth's photograph like a lifeline. "Grandpa?" A gentle voice broke through his thoughts. Andre Carter, Elijah's grandson, hurried up the courthouse steps. At 24, Andre was the image of his father at that age, tall and lean, with intelligent eyes and a quiet confidence. He wore dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his laptop bag slung over one shoulder. "I got here as fast as I could," Andre said, sitting beside his grandfather. "Traffic was terrible. What happened?" Elijah shook his head slowly. "Judge wouldn't even look at the evidence, son. Didn't want to hear about the receipts, the original deed. Nothing." His voice caught. "All those papers your grandmother kept safe all these years might as well have been blank." Andre placed a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "This isn't over, Grandpa. We'll find another way. I know some people who understand computers, records. There has to be something we can do." But Elijah barely seemed to hear him. His eyes were fixed on Ruth's photograph, on her gentle smile that had always given him strength. Now, for the first time, looking at her face brought only pain, the pain of a promise he couldn't keep. The drive home was quiet, Andre navigating through late afternoon traffic while Elijah stared out the window. They passed the neighborhood where the Carter family land had stood for generations. New construction signs dotted the area, promising luxury developments and modern amenities. Each sign felt like a personal insult. Inside his small apartment, so different from the family home they'd lost, Elijah moved like a man in a dream. He went straight to the old family Bible that sat on a shelf beside Ruth's favorite chair. The Bible's pages were filled with handwritten notes spanning generations, births, deaths, marriages, and small victories that had meant everything to the family that recorded them. Andre watched from the doorway as his grandfather's shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. He wanted to help, to say something that would make it better. But what? Words could possibly fill the void of such a profound loss. Meanwhile, in a private chamber of the courthouse, Judge Gregory Harrow was not alone. A man in an expensive suit sat across from him, his posture radiating authority, despite the judge's elevated position. The old man made quite a scene, the suited man said, his tone conversational but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "We can't afford that kind of attention, Gregory. Not with the federal funding coming through next month." "It's handled, James," Harrow replied, though a bead of sweat traced down his temple. "No one takes these historical claims seriously anymore. The media won't touch it. See that they don't." The man stood, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "We've invested too much to let one sentimental old man derail everything. Keep the noise down, or we'll find someone who can." The threat hung in the air long after the man left. Judge Harrow poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon with a slightly trembling hand. Back in the newsroom, Maya Henderson sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen. The cursor blinked accusingly at her as she reviewed her notes from the Carter hearing. Something wasn't adding up. Judge Harrow's dismissal had been too quick, too practiced, as if following a script she couldn't quite see. She opened the courthouse archives, beginning to dig through Harrow's previous rulings. A pattern began to emerge. Case after case where elderly black property owners lost their land to corporate interests. Each ruling cited different technical reasons, but the outcome was always the same. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. "Drop it, Maya. Some stories aren't worth the trouble." But Maya couldn't drop it. She thought of Elijah Carter's face as he clutched his wife's photograph, of the dignity in his bearing even as the system crushed his hopes. She thought of her own grandfather, who had told her stories of land lost and dreams deferred. Making a decision, she began to write down Elijah's contact information. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sun had set by the time. Elijah finally set Ruth's photograph back in its place of honor on the mantel. His tears had dried, leaving behind a hollow ache in his chest. But as he looked at his wife's smiling face, he heard her voice in his memory. "Don't you ever give up, Elijah Carter. Not while there's breath in your body." His phone rang, startling him. An unknown number. "Mr. Carter?" Maya Henderson's voice came through clear and determined. "This is Maya from the courthouse today. I've been doing some research, and I think there's more to your story than the judge wanted to hear. Would you be willing to meet with me?" Elijah looked at Ruth's photograph, at her gentle smile that had always meant hope. "Yes," he said softly. "Yes, I would." The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Elijah Carter's small apartment. As Maya Henderson sat across from him, her recorder placed carefully on the coffee table between them. The walls were lined with family photos, each one telling a piece of the story she'd come to hear. "Tell me about the land, Mr. Carter," Maya said softly, watching as Elijah's weathered hands smoothed over a leather-bound photo album. "Tell me about Ruth." Elijah's eyes grew distant, focusing on memories from happier times. "Ruth and I met on that land, you know. Summer of 1968. She was visiting her cousin who lived next door. I was working the fields with my daddy, and she came walking down that dirt road, wearing a yellow dress." He smiled, lost in the memory. "Said later it was my smile that caught her eye, but I know it was her that lit up the whole world that day." Maya leaned forward, her pen moving across her notebook. There was something in Elijah's voice that spoke of more than just nostalgia. It carried the weight of generations. "The land wasn't just soil and trees to us," he continued. "It was our heritage. My great-grandfather, Benjamin Carter, he bought those 40 acres right after emancipation. Paid for it with money he saved working 3 jobs. The deed, his voice caught. Ruth kept every important paper in her special box. She knew someday we'd need to prove what was ours." From a shelf nearby, Elijah retrieved a worn wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. Inside, carefully preserved documents told the story of the Carter family's connection to their land. Maya's trained eye caught dates, signatures, and official seals, all yellowed with age but still legible. The corporation started moving in about 10 years ago, Elijah explained, his voice hardening. First they bought the Johnson place down the road, then the Williams property. Every time there were stories about unpaid taxes or paperwork problems. Ruth, she saw what was coming. Started making copies of everything, sending them to different family members for safekeeping. A tear rolled down his cheek. She was fighting cancer by then, but she wouldn't rest. "They're not taking our children's inheritance," she'd say. "Not while I have breath in my body." Meanwhile, across town in his small home office, Andre Carter's fingers flew across his keyboard, lines of code reflecting in his glasses. Multiple monitors displayed property records, tax documents, and corporate filings. His friend Marcus, a fellow programmer, peered over his shoulder. "Look at this," Andre said, pointing to a complex web of shell companies and property transfers. "Riverside Development Corporation is just the tip of the iceberg. They're part of a billion-dollar real estate project called Urban Renaissance Initiative." Marcus whistled low. "That's some serious money. But what's this about federal funds?" Andre clicked through several documents. "They're using federal redevelopment grants, money that's supposed to help historically disadvantaged communities. But instead of helping people, they're pushing them out. My grandfather's land is right in the middle of their planned luxury residential district." The screen filled with architectural renderings showing gleaming high-rises and manicured parks where generations of black families had once built their lives. Back in Elijah's apartment, Maya carefully photographed the documents he shared. Many were fragile, their edges crumbling despite Ruth's careful preservation. Land surveys from the 1860s, tax receipts spanning decades, photographs of the Carter family working their land through the years. Each piece told part of a story that the courts had refused to hear. "Ruth kept a diary," Elijah said, his voice soft with grief. "Wrote in it every day, especially after we started having trouble with the corporation. She knew something wasn't right with those tax notices we were getting." He retrieved a well-worn journal bound in faded blue cloth. She wrote about how the amounts kept changing, how our payments would get lost in the system, how the corporation's men would come around, offering to help us with our paperwork if we'd just sign some forms. Maya read entries dating back several years, her journalist's instincts firing at the pattern of harassment and manipulation documented in Ruth's careful handwriting. "Mr. Carter, these dates coincide with other cases I've found. You weren't the only family targeted." In the following days, Maya and Andre began a careful canvass of Elijah's old neighborhood. They knocked on doors, many belonging to elderly residents who remembered the Carter family. Some doors were answered with suspicion, others slammed shut at the mention of Riverside Development. But a few opened, revealing stories that echoed Elijah's own. Sarah Washington, 82 years old, sat in her kitchen clutching a cup of cold tea. "They took my sister's place last year," she whispered, glancing nervously at her windows. "Said she hadn't paid her taxes right. Virginia had receipts for every payment she ever made, but the judge wouldn't even look at them. Same judge as your grandfather had," she added, looking at Andre. James and Martha Wilson, married 53 years, shared similar stories from their front porch. "Been here since 1965, James said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Raised all our children here. Now they're saying our deed isn't valid, because of some clerical error from 40 years ago." Each story added another piece to the puzzle, but many remained afraid to speak openly. "You don't know what they might do," was a common refrain. "Best to just keep quiet and take what they give you." Maya's research led her to Diana Ortega, a former employee of Riverside Development Corporation. Diana worked in records management for 5 years before leaving suddenly 6 months ago. When Maya approached her outside a local coffee shop, Diana's face went pale. "I can't help you," she said immediately, gathering her things to leave. "I signed agreements. They have lawyers." "People are losing their homes," Maya pressed. "Their heritage. Surely that's worth more than a non-disclosure agreement." Diana's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. "You don't understand. These people, they don't just take land, they destroy lives. Anyone who gets in their way. She hurried away, leaving her coffee untouched. The weight of hopelessness began to settle over Elijah. One afternoon, he found himself at the cemetery where Ruth was buried. The autumn wind rustled through nearby trees as he stood before her headstone, polished, granite bearing her name and the dates that bookended her life. "I don't know if I can keep fighting, Ruth," he said aloud, his voice breaking. "Everything you tried to protect, all your careful planning, it's slipping away like water through my fingers." He placed fresh flowers by her grave, yellow roses, like the dress she wore the day they met. "The judge wouldn't even look at the papers you saved. All those nights you stayed up copying documents, making sure we had proof. What was it all for?" A few rows away, hidden by a large memorial, Maya watched silently. She'd come to pay her respects, to try to understand more about the woman whose foresight had preserved so much evidence. Seeing Elijah's private moment of grief made her more determined than ever to uncover the truth. That evening, hope arrived in an unexpected form. Reverend Samuel Thompson of First Baptist Church heard about Elijah's situation through congregation members. He visited Elijah's apartment, bringing with him not just spiritual comfort but practical support. "This isn't just your fight, Brother Carter," the Reverend said, his deep voice filling the small living room. "This is about justice for our whole community. The church stands with you." Reverend Samuel was a tall man with graying hair and eyes that had seen both tragedy and triumph in his 40 years of ministry. He listened as Elijah shared his story, nodding in understanding and occasional anger. "The Lord tells us to seek justice, to defend the oppressed," he said when Elijah finished. "Your wife, Ruth, she knew that. She preserved the truth for just such a time as this. We won't let her work be in vain." The Reverend's visit seemed to breathe new life into Elijah's spirit. But the forces aligned against them were already moving to crush this renewed hope. The next morning, Maya and Elijah each received identical letters on expensive legal stationery. The language was polite, but crystal clear. Any further investigation into Riverside Development Corporation's business practices would result in immediate legal action. The letters mentioned specific details about their families, their jobs, their daily routines, a reminder that they were being watched. Andre, however, had made a breakthrough. Late that night, he called Maya, his voice tense with excitement. "I found something," he said. "I managed to access some public records that weren't properly secured. The deeds they used to claim Grandpa's land? They're forgeries, good ones, but I can prove they were created years after the dates they claim." "How did you get this?" Maya asked, already worried about the legal implications. "Let's just say I know how to spot when a digital backdoor has been left open," Andre replied carefully. "The question is, what do we do with this information?" Maya stared at the threatening letter on her desk, then at the photo of Elijah and Ruth she'd taken for her article. In it, they stood proudly in front of their family home, Ruth's arm around Elijah's waist, both of them smiling at a future they believed in. "We keep fighting," she said finally. "Ruth Carter didn't spend her last days preserving evidence just for us to back down now. But we have to be smart about this. They're watching us, and they're scared." The truth of her words was proven the next day when Elijah received a phone call. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, and carried an unmistakable threat. "Mr. Carter, you have a lovely family. It would be a shame if anything happened to your grandson's promising career, or if that young reporter found herself unable to work in journalism again. Some stories are better left buried with the dead. Don't you think?" Elijah's hands shook as he placed the phone back in its cradle. He looked at Ruth's photograph on the mantel, remembering her strength, her determination to preserve their family's legacy. The threat was clear, but so was his path forward. Outside his window, the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, powerful people were moving against them, trying to bury the truth under layers of legal papers and threats. But Ruth had left them a trail to follow, preserved in her careful handwriting and lovingly maintained documents. Andre's discovery about the forged deeds was like a key turning in a lock. Now they just had to figure out how to use it without putting everyone they loved at risk. "What would you do, Ruth?" Elijah whispered to the quiet room. "How do we fight people? Who can make the law itself work against us?" The answer, he knew, would have to be as careful and methodical as Ruth's preservation of their family papers. They would need not just evidence, but witnesses willing to speak. Not just truth, but a way to make that truth impossible to ignore. As night settled over the city, Elijah, Maya, and Andre each prepared for what would come next. They were no longer just fighting for one piece of land. They were challenging a system that had been stealing dreams for generations. In her apartment, Maya began writing, documenting everything they'd learned. On his computer, Andre backed up his evidence across multiple secure locations. And in his quiet living room, Elijah Carter held his wife's diary and made her a new promise. "We'll finish what you started, Ruth," he whispered. "No matter what it takes." The basement of First Baptist Church hummed with nervous energy. Metal folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as a small group of elderly residents settled in, their faces a mixture of hope and hesitation. Elijah Carter stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, watching as Maya Henderson helped an older woman with a walker find her seat. "Thank you all for coming," Elijah began, his voice carrying the same dignity he'd shown in the courtroom. "I know many of you took a risk just being here tonight." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he looked at the faces before him. 15 people, most of them his age or older, each carrying stories similar to his own. Sarah Washington sat in the front row, clutching her purse like a shield. James and Martha Wilson held hands in the back, their wedding bands catching the light. "My wife, Ruth," Elijah continued, his voice softening at her name. "She used to say that a community is like a quilt. Each piece has its own story, but together, they make something stronger." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "They tried to tear us apart, piece by piece, hoping we wouldn't notice the pattern. But Ruth saw it. She kept records, just like some of you did." Sarah Washington raised a trembling hand. "But what good are records when the judges won't even look at them? My sister Virginia," her voice cracked. "She lost everything." Elijah nodded sympathetically. "That's why we're here. Not just to share our stories, but to join them together, make them too big to ignore." Maya stepped forward, her notebook open. "I've been investigating similar cases across the city. The pattern is clear. Riverside Development Corporation specifically targets properties owned by elderly Black families. They manipulate tax records, create false liens, and use their influence in the courts to steal land that's been in families for generations." A murmur ran through the small crowd. An elderly man in a worn suit raised his hand. "My name's William Parker. They took my place last spring. Said I hadn't paid property taxes in 3 years, but I had receipts for every payment. Just like they did to us," Martha Wilson added, her voice stronger now. "Same excuse, same judge, same result." One by one, stories spilled out. Each person had kept records, fighting in their own way against a system designed to overwhelm them. As they spoke, Maya noticed something changing in their faces, fear giving way to determination, isolation to solidarity. "We need a name," someone called out. "Something to show we're united." Elijah looked at Ruth's photograph, which he'd propped on the podium. "The Carter's legacy," he said softly. "Not just for Ruth and me, but for all of us fighting to protect our legacy." The name settled over the room like a blessing. People nodded, straightened in their chairs. It wasn't just a group anymore. It was a movement. Meanwhile, across town, Maya sat at her desk in the newspaper office, her computer screen glowing in the late-night darkness. Her first article about the corruption in Judge Harrow's court was ready to publish. She'd checked every fact, verified every quote, knowing the corporation's lawyers would pounce on any mistake. Her finger hovered over the publish button when her phone buzzed with a text from Andre. "You need to see this. Check your email." The documents Andre had uncovered were damning. Tax records showed systematic manipulation. payments marked as missing despite bank records proving they'd been received, property assessments artificially inflated to create impossible tax burdens, and behind it all, a web of shell companies leading back to Riverside Development. Maya added key details from Andre's findings to her article, her hands shaking slightly as she typed. This wasn't just about one family's land anymore. It was about exposing a system of legalized theft that had operated in the shadows for years. At 11:47 p.m., she hit publish. By morning, the story was spreading. Social media picked up key quotes and details. Local news stations began calling for interviews. But most importantly, more victims started coming forward. Diana Ortega watched the story unfold on her phone during her lunch break at her new job, a small accounting firm where she'd taken a significant pay cut to escape Riverside Development. The article quoted anonymous sources about the corporation's practices, making her wonder who else had found the courage to speak. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone and called Maya's office number. "I want to help," she said, when Maya answered. "But I need protection. These people, they destroy lives. I've seen it." Maya's voice was steady, reassuring. "We'll protect your identity. Tell me what you know." Diana's story poured out. Years of watching the corporation target vulnerable homeowners, manipulate records, bribe officials. "I kept copies," she admitted. "Downloaded everything I could before I left. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared." "You're doing the right thing now?" Maya assured her. "That's what matters." The next Sunday, Reverend Samuel's sermon drew a larger crowd than usual. Word had spread about his support for Elijah and the coalition. His deep voice filled the church as he spoke about justice, community, and the moral obligation to stand against evil. "When our brothers and sisters cry out for justice," he thundered, "we cannot remain silent. When the powerful prey upon the vulnerable, we cannot look away." The congregation responded with amens and raised hands. After the service, more people approached Elijah, sharing their own stories, offering support. But the corporation wasn't idle. That afternoon, Elijah returned home to find his apartment door slightly ajar. Inside, drawers had been ransacked, papers scattered. Ruth's diary lay open on the floor, several pages torn out. The violation hit him like a physical blow. He sank into Ruth's old chair, surrounded by the chaos of the search. But as he began to clean up, he found something tucked inside the family Bible. A letter from Ruth he'd never seen before, dated just weeks before she passed. "My dearest Elijah," it began. "If you're reading this, it means they've come for our land, just as I feared they would. Don't let them break your spirit, my love. The truth has a way of coming to light no matter how deep they try to bury it. Fight for what's right, even when it feels impossible. I'll be with you every step of the way." Tears blurred his vision as he read her words. Even now, Ruth was helping him find strength. The corporation's intimidation tactics continued. Maya's car was vandalized, her tires slashed. Andre received threatening emails warning him about accidental data breaches that could ruin his career. But for every act of intimidation, the community responded with support. Church members took turns staying with Elijah to ensure his safety. Tech-savvy teenagers from the neighborhood helped Andre secure his computer systems. Local businesses offered meeting spaces for the coalition. Diana's documents proved crucial. They revealed that the CEO's wife, Patricia Whitman, owned significant shares in shell companies that directly profited from the land grabs. The connection was buried under layers of corporate paperwork, but it was there. A direct line between the corruption and those orchestrating it. "This is bigger than we thought," Andre told Maya as they reviewed the evidence. "The federal, redevelopment funds, the shell companies, the judicial corruption, it's all connected." Maya nodded, already planning her next article. "And now we can prove it." The coalition grew stronger with each meeting. What had started with 15 nervous people in a church basement now filled the main sanctuary. Families brought children and grandchildren, ensuring the next generation would know their history and understand the importance of fighting for justice. Elijah often began meetings by sharing stories about Ruth, her determination, her foresight, her love for their community. Her spirit seemed to infuse the movement, giving people courage when fear threatened to overwhelm them. Sarah Washington, once too frightened to speak above a whisper, now led a committee documenting similar cases across the city. James and Martha Wilson opened their home for strategy sessions. William Parker used his connections as a retired postal worker to help distribute information through informal networks. The corporation's lawyers sent cease and desist letters, threatened lawsuits, tried to intimidate coalition members with legal jargon and veiled threats. But Ruth's letter had given Elijah a new kind of strength. Not the desperate courage of a man fighting alone, but the steady resolve of someone carrying forward a sacred trust. Local media began picking up Maya's stories. Photos of elderly residents being evicted from family homes sparked public outrage. Social media hashtags spread awareness. Small donations began flowing in to help with legal fees. One evening, as sunset painted the church windows in shades of gold, Elijah stood before the growing coalition. The pews were filled with faces both familiar and new. Young activists working alongside elderly homeowners, tech experts sharing knowledge with community elders. Ruth knew this day would come, he said, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the sanctuary. She knew they'd try to take everything we built, but she also knew something they didn't. That our strength isn't in our land alone, but in our unity. He held up his wife's torn diary. They thought they could silence us by destroying evidence, by threatening our families, by corrupting the courts. But Ruth taught me that the truth is like a seed. You can try to bury it, but if it's meant to grow, it'll find its way to the light. The coalition members nodded, many wiping away tears. They'd all lost something to the corporation's greed: homes, savings, family histories. But they'd found something too: a community united in purpose, strengthened by shared struggle. Diana, watching from the back of the church, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She'd spent years carrying the guilt of her complicity in the corporation's schemes. Now, by helping expose the truth, she was finally doing what she knew was right. As the meeting ended, people lingered, sharing stories and strategies. Maya interviewed new coalition members, documenting their experiences. Andre showed elderly residents how to secure their personal records digitally. The church buzzed with energy and purpose. Outside, the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Elijah stood on the church steps, Ruth's letter in his pocket. The coalition had given him more than hope. It had given him a way to fulfill his promise to Ruth, to fight for what was right. The corporation's power seemed to shimmer in the gleaming office towers downtown, but something stronger was growing in the hearts and minds of the community. With each person who joined the coalition, with each story shared and documented, with each piece of evidence brought to light, the truth grew harder to suppress. Ruth had known it all along: the power of community, the importance of preserving history, the strength found in standing together. As Elijah looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, he whispered a quiet thank you to his wife. Her legacy wasn't just in the land they'd lost or the documents she'd preserved. It was in the movement she'd helped inspire, the courage she'd helped awaken in others. The fight was far from over, but they were no longer fighting alone. The sound of splintering wood shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Elijah Carter jolted awake in his armchair, Ruth's diary still open in his lap. Heavy footsteps thundered through his apartment as dark figures swept in, their faces hidden behind masks. "Don't move," a harsh voice commanded. "This is a legal search." Elijah's hands trembled as he watched them tear through his home. They moved with purpose, heading straight for his carefully organized documents. Ruth's special box was yanked from its shelf, papers spilling across the floor. Her diary was snatched from his lap, despite his desperate grab to hold onto it. "Please," he begged. "That's all I have left of my wife." One of the men paused, turned toward him. In the dim light, Elijah caught a glimpse of cold eyes behind the mask. "Should have thought of that before you started making trouble, old man." Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind upturned furniture and scattered memories. Elijah sat in the chaos, his chest tight with grief and anger. Ruth's presence, which had always filled the apartment through her preserved documents and diary, felt suddenly devastatingly absent. Across town, another drama was unfolding. Andre's small house erupted with shouts and the crash of computer equipment hitting the floor. He was hauled from his bed by armed officers, barely given time to pull on a shirt before being handcuffed. Andre Carter, you're under arrest for cyber crimes, including unauthorized access of protected systems and data theft. Maya received the call about Andre's arrest while driving to work. She swerved to the curb, her hands shaking as she processed the news. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Diana. They're moving against everyone. Be careful. At First Baptist Church, Reverend Samuel paced his office, listening to the reports flowing in from congregation members. Several coalition leaders had been targeted overnight, homes searched, family members questioned, jobs suddenly threatened with anonymous complaints. The coalition's next meeting was subdued. The church basement felt emptier, heavy with fear. Those who did attend spoke, in whispers, jumping at every sound from above. "Where's Andre?" Sarah Washington asked, her voice quavering. Elijah stood at the front of the room, looking older than his 75 years, but somehow unbowed. "My grandson was arrested this morning. They're calling him a criminal for exposing their crimes." A gasp rippled through the group. Martha Wilson began to cry softly, her husband's arm around her shoulders. "They took everything," Elijah continued. "All of Ruth's papers, her diary, every piece of evidence we had. But they couldn't take our memories, our truth." His voice caught as he thought of Ruth's diary in strangers' hands. Those pages held not just evidence, but the intimate thoughts of his beloved wife, her hopes and fears, her final messages to him. The sound of footsteps on the stairs silenced the room. Maya appeared, her face drawn with exhaustion. She'd spent the morning trying to find out where Andre was being held, what specific charges he faced. "They've set his bail at $500,000, she announced. "Way beyond what any of us could afford. They want him to stay locked up." The news hit Elijah like a physical blow. He swayed slightly, and Reverend Samuel stepped forward to steady him. "This isn't just about silencing us anymore," Maya continued. "They're trying to destroy us. The corporation's lawyers are already spinning stories about radical activists and cybercrime rings." William Parker stood up from his seat near the back. "My son lost his job this morning. No explanation given. He just happened to be at our last meeting." More stories emerged. Children of coalition members suddenly expelled from private schools. Elderly members finding their medical insurance mysteriously canceled. Small businesses facing surprise health and safety inspections. The pressure began taking its toll. Elijah, overwhelmed by the loss of Ruth's diary and Andre's arrest, collapsed during the meeting. The thud of his fall sent panic through the room. "Call an ambulance," Reverend Samuel shouted, kneeling beside the unconscious man. In the hospital waiting room, Maya paced restlessly. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as she struggled with guilt and frustration. Had they pushed too hard? Too fast? Should she have seen this retaliation coming? The doctor's news was both relieving and concerning. Elijah was stable. Stress and exhaustion had caused a temporary drop in blood pressure, but his condition highlighted the vulnerability of their elderly members to the corporation's pressure tactics. Diana visited Elijah's hospital room that evening, slipping in after regular visiting hours. Her face showed the strain of her own battles. She'd received notice that morning that she was being sued for breach of contract. "I have to tell you something," she said, perching nervously on the edge of a chair. "My mother, she went through this too." Elijah turned from the window, noting the pain in Diana's voice. "It was 15 years ago," Diana continued. "We lived in a different part of the city, but it was the same story. Mysterious tax problems, lost payments, court dates that got changed without notice. My mother had all her documents organized, just like your wife did." She wiped away a tear. "They took everything. The stress, it broke her. She never really recovered. The confession seemed to age her, but also straightened her spine. That's why I took those documents when I left Riverside. I couldn't let them keep doing this to other families. Maya arrived as Diana was leaving. The two women exchanged knowing looks, both understanding the weight of their roles in this fight. The civil rights lawyers working on Andre's case think they can get the bail reduced, Maya told Elijah. But it's going to take time. They're claiming he accessed classified corporate data and linking him to broader cybercrime investigations. Elijah nodded wearily. They're using him to send a message, just like they used that raid to take Ruth's diary. Maya pulled a chair close to his bed. About that, I've been thinking. Ruth was too smart to keep all her evidence in one place. You said she sent copies to family members? Yes, but Elijah's eyes widened with sudden remembrance. Her sister in Georgia. Ruth sent her a package every month for the last year of her life. Said it was just family photos and recipes, but hope flickered in Maya's eyes. Do you have her contact? Information? Before Elijah could answer, his hospital room door opened. Andre's mother, Lisa, rushed in, her face tight with worry. Daddy, have you heard anything new about Andre? They won't let me see him. The sight of his daughter's distress pierced Elijah's heart. He'd been fighting for his family's legacy, but now that fight had put his grandson behind bars. I'm so sorry, baby, he whispered. This is all my fault. No, Daddy. Lisa took his hand firmly. This is their fault. Andre knew what he was doing. He's as stubborn as Mama was. When he believes in something, he commits completely. Outside, the hospital. The coalition's supporters gathered for a candlelight vigil. The local news crews that showed up expecting to film a small group of elderly protesters found instead a diverse crowd of hundreds, young activists standing shoulder to shoulder with church members, community leaders mixing with college students. Reverend. Samuel's prayer carried across the crowd. Lord, give us strength to endure this trial. Give us courage to stand firm in the face of injustice. And Lord, protect those who suffer for speaking truth to power. The corporation's response was swift. Private security guards appeared, filming protesters. Police cruisers circled the block, with increasing frequency. Hospital administrators nervously asked the crowd to disperse. But something had changed. The corporation's heavy-handed retaliation had transformed a local dispute into a symbol of resistance. Social media buzzed with hashtags supporting Andre and the coalition. Civil rights organizations began issuing statements of support. In his hospital bed, Elijah watched the vigil on the local news. The sight of so many candles glowing in the darkness reminded him of something Ruth used to say. One light might seem small, but when we all shine together, even the deepest darkness can't last. Maya stayed late, working on her laptop from a corner of Elijah's room. Her articles about Andre's arrest and the raid on Elijah's home had gone viral, drawing national attention. But with that attention came increased pressure. Her editor had called earlier, expressing concerns about potential lawsuits. Maybe we should hold off on any new articles until things settle down, he'd suggested. They won't settle down, Maya had replied. That's what they're counting on, that we'll back off if they hit us hard enough. Now, watching Elijah finally drift into an exhausted sleep, Maya felt the weight of their struggle. The coalition had lost nearly all its physical evidence. Their most tech-savvy members sat in a jail cell. Their elderly members were being terrorized into silence, but they'd also gained something powerful: public attention. The corporation's attempts to crush them had instead exposed their brutality for all to see. Diana's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. We know what you took. Last chance to return everything and walk away. She stared at the screen, remembering her mother's face the day they lost their home. The fear that had kept her quiet for so long battled with a growing anger. Opening her secure email account, she began copying files to an encrypted drive. The corporation might be able to silence some voices, but they couldn't stop the truth from spreading. Back at First Baptist Church, Reverend Samuel found Martha Wilson sitting alone in the sanctuary, praying softly. I keep thinking about Andre. she said when she noticed him. Such a bright young man, sitting in jail for trying to help his grandfather. She wiped her eyes. James wants us to step back from the coalition. Says we're too old for this fight. The Reverend sat beside her. Sister Martha, do you remember when this church was firebombed in 1963? The people who did it thought they could scare us into silence. But the very next Sunday, we held service right here in the ashes, singing louder than ever. Martha managed a small smile. I remember. My mama was in that choir. Evil depends on our fear, the Reverend continued. When we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, that's when justice has a chance to grow. In his jail cell, Andre tried to stay focused on what he'd learned about the corporation's digital security. They'd taken his computers, but they couldn't take the knowledge in his head. Sooner or later, he'd get a chance to share what he'd found. A guard appeared at his cell. Carter, you've got a visitor. Andre's heart leapt, thinking it might be his mother. Instead, a smooth-voiced man in an expensive suit waited in the visitation room. Mr. Carter. The man smiled without warmth. I represent Riverside Development Corporation. I'm here to offer you a deal. The next morning, Maya rushed into Elijah's hospital room, waving a printout. You won't believe what I just received. It's an email from Ruth's sister in Georgia. She says she has everything. Copies of all the documents, Ruth's backup diary, even records Ruth didn't tell you about. Elijah felt tears well up in his eyes. Even now, months after her death, Ruth was still fighting alongside them, still protecting their legacy. The doctor had cleared him to leave the hospital, though he was under strict orders to rest, but rest would have to wait. They had work to do. Outside his window, the sun was rising over the city. Somewhere in that sprawl of buildings and streets, Andre sat in a cell. Diana faced her fears, and countless other families clutched their own precious documents, wondering if they'd be next. But Ruth's voice seemed to whisper in his heart. Don't you give up now, Elijah Carter. The darkest night just means dawn is coming. The local news station's bright lights illuminated Elijah Carter's weathered face as he sat across from the interviewer, his posture straight despite his recent hospital stay. His hands rested on Ruth's newly recovered diary, sent overnight by her sister in Georgia, along with boxes of meticulously organized documents. Mr. Carter, the interviewer began, tell us about the day you learned your family's land was being taken. Elijah's voice was steady, carrying decades of dignity and pain. My great-grandfather bought that land in 1867. He was a freed slave who worked 3 jobs to pay for every acre. That land meant something more than just property. It was proof that we could build something lasting, something to pass down to our children. The camera caught the tremor in his hands as he opened Ruth's diary. My wife, Ruth, she saw what was coming. While she was fighting cancer, she spent her last months documenting everything, making copies, protecting our legacy. Then last week, they broke into our home and stole her diary, trying to silence us. The interviewer leaned forward. And your grandson Andre remains in jail? They arrested him for exposing their lies, Elijah replied, his voice breaking slightly. A young man who wanted to protect his grandmother's legacy, treated like a criminal while the real criminals hide behind lawyers and judges. The interview aired that evening. Within hours, clips began spreading across social media. Elijah's quiet dignity, the story of his great-grandfather's sacrifice, the image of Ruth fighting to preserve their history even as cancer took her strength. It resonated with people in a way that dry legal arguments never could. Justice for Andre Carter started trending nationally. Local news stations picked up the story, then national outlets. Journalists began digging into Riverside Development's history, uncovering similar cases across the country. Maya's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from other reporters, seeking comments, civil rights organizations offering support, and most importantly, more victims coming forward with their own stories. The breakthrough came 3 days after the interview. Andre's lawyers, armed with new evidence and backed by mounting public pressure, filed an emergency motion challenging his detention. The hearing was set for the following morning. The courthouse steps were packed with supporters. Signs bearing Andre's face and messages of support filled the air. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the morning sky. Inside the courtroom, a different judge presided. Not Harrow, who had suddenly taken a leave of absence as investigations into his conduct intensified. The new judge, Angela Martinez, reviewed the evidence with sharp eyes and pointed questions. "Your Honor," Andre's lawyer argued, "the prosecution's case relies entirely on claims that Mr. Carter accessed private corporate data. However, we can prove that every document he uncovered was actually public record, illegally hidden through deliberate miscategorization." The prosecution's case began crumbling under scrutiny. By noon, Andre walked free on his own recognizance, emerging into sunlight and a roar of cheers. Elijah waited at the top of the courthouse steps, tears streaming down his face as he embraced his grandson. Cameras flashed around them, capturing the moment that would appear on front pages across the country. "Grandma Ruth would be proud," Andre whispered in his ear. Diana watched the scene unfold on her office computer, her hands shaking as she opened another encrypted file. The corporation's lawyers had been calling her hourly, alternating between threats and offers of settlement. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but not doing it costs even more." Taking a deep breath, she began uploading documents, internal emails showing executives joking about getting rid of the old folks, detailed plans for using tax law loopholes to seize properties, spreadsheets tracking judgments by friendly judges. Like Harrow. Within the corporation's gleaming headquarters, panic was spreading. Board members huddled in emergency sessions as their stock price began to drop. Whistleblowers, emboldened by Andre's release and Diana's example, started coming forward. "We have to contain this," James Whitman, the CEO, demanded. His face had grown gaunt with stress, his usual polished appearance showing cracks. Where are these leaks coming from? But the tide of truth couldn't be contained. Maya's latest article revealed direct connections between Judge Harrow's favorable rulings and offshore accounts tied to his family. Email records showed Patricia Whitman, the CEO's wife, personally selecting properties for acquisition based on the vulnerability of their elderly owners. The public response was immediate and fierce. Protesters surrounded Riverside Development's offices, their signs demanding justice. Civil rights organizations announced class action lawsuits. Local politicians, sensing the shifting winds, began calling for investigations. Back at First Baptist Church, the coalition's meeting room overflowed with new supporters. Elijah stood at the podium, Ruth's diary open before him. "My wife wrote something here that I want to share," he said, his finger tracing her familiar handwriting. She wrote, "They think we're weak because we're old, because we're poor, because we're black. But they don't understand that our strength comes from generations of survival, from countless moments of refusing to break." The room hummed with murmurs of agreement. Sarah Washington sat straighter in her chair. Martha Wilson squeezed her husband's hand. Faces young and old, black and white, turned toward Elijah with renewed purpose. Maya, sitting near the back with her laptop, watched as social media exploded with new revelations. Diana's leaked documents had opened floodgates. Former employees shared stories of being ordered to falsify records. Public officials came forward about being pressured to approve permits and zoning changes. In her office across town, Diana received another threatening message. This time, instead of deleting it, she forwarded it to Maya with a note. "Add it to the evidence pile. I'm done being afraid." The corporation's lawyers launched a desperate counteroffensive, filing lawsuits against coalition members for defamation, conspiracy, and interference with business relationships. But their usual tactics of legal intimidation fell flat in the face of growing public outrage. Local businesses began publicly supporting the coalition. A tech company offered Andre a job, praising his skills and integrity. A law firm specializing in civil rights cases took on the coalition's cases pro bono. Judge Harrow, watching his carefully constructed world crumble, made a fatal mistake. In a rage-filled phone call to James Whitman, recorded by his own security system and leaked by a household employee, he revealed the full extent of their arrangement. "I did everything you asked," his voice thundered through social media shares. "I shut down their cases, I ignored evidence, I followed the damn script. You promised to protect me." Whitman's response was equally damaging. "Keep your mouth shut. And remember who owns you, Gregory. One word about the kickbacks and you'll lose more than just your robe." The recording reached Maya's inbox at midnight. By dawn, it was playing on national news networks. Judge Harrow's office announced his immediate retirement, but state and federal investigators were already reviewing every case he'd handled. Andre, now working to create a database of similar cases nationwide, discovered patterns that stretched back decades. The same corporations using different names but linked ownership had been executing similar land grabs across the country. "It's not just about our community anymore," he told Elijah as they reviewed his findings. "This is happening everywhere. But now people are finally paying attention." Elijah nodded, thinking of Ruth. She knew. That's why she was so careful with her documentation. She knew someday someone would need to connect all these pieces. The corporation's board of directors called an emergency session. Stockholders were demanding answers. Federal regulators had opened investigations. James Whitman's position as CEO was increasingly tenuous. Patricia Whitman, watching her carefully crafted social position crumble, attempted damage control through a tone-deaf interview. "These people should be grateful," she declared. "We're bringing progress to declining neighborhoods. If they can't maintain their properties to modern standards, perhaps it's time to let others take over." The backlash was immediate. Videos of elderly residents caring for their historic homes, maintaining gardens and porches their grandparents had built, flooded social media in response. The contrast between their dignity and Patricia Whitman's condescension couldn't have been clearer. Reverend Samuel's Sunday sermon drew overflow crowds. "David didn't defeat Goliath with another giant," he preached. "He used truth as his stone, faith as his sling. When we stand together in truth, no corporate giant can withstand us." The collection plates that day overflowed with donations for the coalition's legal fund. Church members signed up to help elderly residents document their property records and digitize important papers. Maya's editor, who had once cautioned her about pursuing the story, now gave her free rein. "This is the kind of journalism that changes things," he admitted. "Keep digging." Diana, despite increasing pressure from corporate lawyers, continued providing evidence. Each new document revealed another layer of corruption, another connection between powerful figures who had profited from the community's loss. In his apartment, Elijah spent evenings reading Ruth's recovered diary. Her words, even from beyond death, continued to guide their fight. "The truth is like water," she had written. "It finds every crack, fills every space, and eventually overcomes any barrier in its path." The coalition set up a weekly legal clinic, where elderly residents could get help securing their property records. Young lawyers volunteered their time, working alongside tech-savvy students who helped create digital backups of important documents. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore," Elijah told them during one session. "We're making sure this can't happen to anyone else's grandparents, anyone else's legacy." Coverage of the scandal spread to international media. Documentary filmmakers began interviewing coalition members, capturing their stories for posterity. Academics started writing papers about the intersection of racial justice, elder rights, and corporate accountability. Andre's database project grew as similar cases from across the country poured in. Patterns emerged showing how predatory corporations had systematically targeted elderly minority communities, using legal complexity and judicial corruption to steal generational wealth. The corporation's stock price continued to fall as more investors withdrew support. Board members began quietly distancing themselves, refusing to defend actions they had once readily approved. James Whitman was photographed leaving his office with a box of personal items, his once commanding presence diminished by scandal. Within hours, Riverside Development announced an executive transition and promised a thorough internal review. But the coalition wasn't interested in corporate promises anymore. They had seen the power of their united voices, their shared stories, their collective demand for justice. In Ruth's diary, on one of the last pages she wrote, was a message that seemed to predict this moment. When the powerful think they've won, that's when they're most vulnerable. Their strength is built on isolation, keeping us afraid, keeping us apart. But our strength grows when we come together, when we refuse to be silenced, when we hold on to hope. As news crews set up for another day of coverage outside the corporate headquarters, Elijah sat in his apartment, holding Ruth's photograph. "We did it, my love," he whispered. "We showed them that truth can't be buried, that justice will find its way to the light." The morning sun streamed through his window, casting a warm glow over Ruth's image. Somewhere in the city, Diana was preparing to testify before a grand jury. Andre was helping another community set up a database of property records. Maya was writing another story exposing decades of systematic theft. The tide hadn't just turned. It had become a wave of change that would reshape the landscape of power and justice in ways the corporate giants never saw coming. Dawn broke over the city courthouse as hundreds gathered on its steps. The morning air buzzed with anticipation. As reporters set up their cameras and microphones, among the crowd, elderly residents stood shoulder to shoulder with young activists, many holding signs bearing Ruth Carter's photo, alongside the words, "Justice delayed is justice denied." District Attorney Sarah Mitchell stood before a wall of microphones, her voice firm and clear. "After reviewing substantial evidence of judicial misconduct and corporate fraud, my office is reopening all cases dismissed by Judge Gregory Harrow involving Riverside Development Corporation. Additionally, we are launching a full investigation into allegations of systematic fraud and corruption." Inside the courthouse, Elijah Carter sat quietly in the front row, Ruth's diary resting in his lap. The same courtroom that had dismissed him months ago now felt different, charged with possibility rather than despair. Maya Henderson sat beside him, her laptop open and ready to document every moment. Judge Angela Martinez entered the courtroom, her reputation for fairness and integrity a stark contrast to Harrow's tainted legacy. The gallery was packed with coalition members, reporters, and civil rights activists. Judge Harrow sat at the defense table, his once immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His expensive suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Next to him, James Whitman and other corporate executives filled the defense section, their usual arrogance dampened by uncertainty. "These proceedings," Judge Martinez began, "will examine evidence of systematic fraud in property acquisitions by Riverside Development Corporation, as well as allegations of judicial misconduct in related cases. Mr. Carter's case will serve as the primary example, but the findings will impact all similar cases under review." Elijah approached the witness stand, feeling the weight of generations on his shoulders. This time, when he spoke about his family's legacy, every ear in the courtroom strained to listen. "My great-grandfather," he began, his voice steady and clear, "was born into slavery. After emancipation, he worked 3 jobs to buy our land. He understood something that his children, and their children after them, never forgot. That ownership of land meant freedom, meant having something to pass down, meant being able to stand tall and say, 'This is mine.'" He opened Ruth's diary, reading from a marked page. "My wife wrote here, 'They think they can erase us with paperwork and legal terms, but our roots go deeper than their laws. Our truth is written in the soil itself.'" The prosecution presented their case methodically. Diana Ortega took the stand, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she detailed years of corporate manipulation. "It was systematic," she testified. "We had lists of properties owned by elderly residents, especially in black neighborhoods. We would create artificial tax problems, lose their payments, change court dates without notice. Everything was designed to make them lose their homes legally, even though there was nothing legal about what we were doing." Andre demonstrated how the corporation had hidden public records and manipulated property data. His technical expertise translated complex fraud into terms anyone could understand. "They didn't just hide information," he explained, displaying documents on the courtroom screens. They created a digital maze to make it impossible for owners to prove their rights. But they left traces. Every fraudulent change, every hidden record had a digital fingerprint. Throughout the morning, evidence mounted. Former corporate employees testified about falsifying documents. Public officials admitted to being bribed. Maya's detailed reporting was entered into evidence, along with Ruth's meticulously preserved records. During a brief recess, Elijah stood in the courthouse hallway, looking out at the crowd still growing outside. Sarah Washington touched his arm gently. "You know what Ruth would say if she could see this?" She smiled, tears in her eyes. She'd say, "I told you the truth would find its way." When the court reconvened, the defense began their desperate counterattack. Corporate lawyers tried to paint Diana as a disgruntled employee, Andre as a hacker, the elderly residents as negligent property owners. But their arguments fell apart under examination. Every accusation they made was countered by documentation, much of it preserved by Ruth Carter's foresight. Judge Harrow was called to testify. As he took the stand, his eyes briefly met Elijah's. For a moment, something like shame flickered across his face. "Judge Harrow," the prosecutor began, "can you explain these deposits to your offshore accounts? The dates correspond precisely with your dismissals of cases against Riverside Development." Harrow's composure cracked. Years of arrogance and corruption crumbled under the weight of evidence and public scrutiny. "We were assured it was legal," he stammered. "The corporation's lawyers provided documentation showing the properties were legitimately acquired. I simply followed." "Did you ever actually examine the evidence presented by the property owners?" the prosecutor pressed. Harrow's silence was damning. James Whitman took the stand next, his corporate polish unable to hide his growing desperation. The prosecution presented email after email, showing his direct involvement in targeting elderly homeowners. "It was business," he insisted. "Urban renewal requires difficult decisions. We operated within the law." "Within the law?" The prosecutor held up Ruth's diary. "Is that why your company hired men to break into an elderly man's home and steal his deceased wife's personal papers? Was that urban renewal as well?" Whitman's face reddened. "I had no knowledge of any break-in." "Really?" the prosecutor played. A recording, James Whitman's voice ordering whatever it takes to silence the coalition's protests. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Martinez called for order, but the damage was done. Throughout the afternoon, more witnesses took the stand. Martha Wilson testified about losing her sister's home. William Parker described years of harassment and fraudulent tax claims. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of corporate greed and systematic racism. Maya's live blog of the proceedings crashed news websites as millions followed along. Outside, the crowd had grown so large that police closed surrounding streets. Signs bearing Ruth's photo were raised high, her smile becoming a symbol of resistance and hope. Late in the day, Patricia Whitman was called to testify. Her entrance caused a stir. Gone was the polished socialite who had dismissed the elderly. Residence is irrelevant. In her place sat a woman who realized her world was crumbling. "Mrs. Whitman," the prosecutor began, "can you explain these property transfers? Multiple parcels of land taken from elderly residents, transferred through shell companies, and ultimately ending up in your private real estate portfolio?" "Patricia." Whitman's carefully constructed facade cracked. "I was protecting my interests," she snapped. "These people, they don't understand progress. They're holding on to the past while we're trying to build the future." "And who gets to be part of that future, Mrs. Whitman?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. As the day drew to a close, Judge Martinez called a brief recess. Before her ruling, in the courthouse hallway, Elijah found himself surrounded by coalition members. "Whatever happens," he told them, "Ruth was right. The truth does find its way. Maybe not as fast as we'd like, but it comes." Andre put his arm around his grandfather's shoulders. "It's already happened, Grandpa. Win or lose today, people know the truth now. They can't hide anymore." When court resumed, Judge Martinez's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The evidence presented today reveals not just individual acts of fraud, but a systematic campaign to deprive citizens of their property rights through corruption, manipulation, and intimidation. This court cannot and will not sanction such behavior. She looked directly at Harrow. Your Honor, you will step down from the bench immediately pending criminal investigation. Your cases involving Riverside Development will be reopened and reviewed by an independent panel. Turning to the corporate defendants, she continued. Riverside Development Corporation's actions represent a gross abuse of legal process and human rights. This court orders an immediate freeze on all property transfers and development projects pending full investigation. The gallery erupted in cheers. Judge Martinez banged her gavel for order, but a smile tugged at her lips. Mr. Carter, she said, looking at Elijah, your family's land will be returned to you immediately. Furthermore, this court orders Riverside Development to establish a compensation fund for all affected families. Tears streamed down Elijah's face as he clutched Ruth's diary. Around him, coalition members embraced, their joy tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that some, like Ruth, hadn't lived to see this day. Outside the courthouse, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Reporters thrust microphones toward Elijah, asking for his reaction. My wife, Ruth, he began, his voice thick with emotion. She used to say that justice is like a seed. It needs people to plant it, water it, protect it while it grows. Today, we saw the first fruits of what she planted. Maya posted her final update of the day. Judge rules for justice, Carter family legacy restored. Within minutes, the story went viral, spreading across the globe. In his private chambers, Judge Harrow removed his robe for the last time, placing it carefully on his chair. His hands trembled as he thought about the investigations to come. James and Patricia Whitman were escorted to their car through a back entrance, their empire crumbling around them. The board of directors was already calling an emergency meeting to discuss their removal. Diana stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by other former employees who had found the courage to speak out. Their testimonies had helped expose decades of corporate fraud. Andre hugged his grandfather tightly. Grandma Ruth would be so proud, he whispered. She knows, Elijah replied, looking up at the evening sky. She's always known. As darkness fell, the crowd slowly dispersed. But something had changed in the city. A shift in power, a restoration of justice, a reminder that truth, though sometimes buried, will always find its way to light. Back in his apartment, Elijah placed Ruth's diary in its place of honor on the mantel. Her photograph smiled down at him, and for the first time since losing her, he felt complete peace. We did it, my love, he whispered. We planted your seeds of justice, and look what grew. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing a story, a home, a legacy protected by the truth Ruth had helped preserve. The Department of Justice press conference drew national media attention. Deputy Attorney General Michael Bennett stood at the podium, his expression grave as he addressed the cameras. Following the revelations in the Carter case, our investigation has uncovered a nationwide pattern of corporate land theft targeting minority communities, he announced. Today, we're launching a federal task force to examine similar cases across all 50 states. In the audience, Maya Henderson sat beside Elijah Carter, both taking careful notes. The scope of what they'd uncovered had grown far beyond their initial fight. On the screen behind Bennett, a map showed hundreds of red dots, each representing a case similar to Elijah's. The corruption we've uncovered extends beyond Riverside Development, Bennett continued. We've identified multiple corporations using identical tactics to systematically strip generational wealth from vulnerable communities. The revelation sent shockwaves through the financial world. Stock prices plummeted as investors rushed to distance themselves from implicated companies. Corporate boardrooms across the country scrambled to examine their own practices, fearful of being the next target of investigation. Back in their city, Elijah had become a symbol of resistance. Interview requests poured in from national news programs, documentary filmmakers, and civil rights organizations. But it was a local youth group's invitation that touched him most deeply. Our children need to hear your story, the invitation read. They need to know that justice is possible. Standing before a room of young faces at the community center, Elijah held up Ruth's photograph. My wife believed in leaving footprints for others to follow, he began. She knew that each generation's struggle makes the path clearer for the next. The students listened intently as he shared his family's history, Ruth's foresight, and the importance of preserving one's heritage. After the talk, a young girl approached him, her eyes bright with purpose. My grandma's fighting the same battle, she said. Can you help us? Meanwhile, Maya's career had taken an unexpected turn. Major publications competed for her stories, but she chose to stay with her local paper, establishing a dedicated investigative unit focused on corporate accountability and community justice. The national spotlight is important, she told her editor. But the real stories are still here in our communities. This is where change happens first. Her latest article series, America's Hidden Land Theft, was being considered for a Pulitzer Prize. But more importantly to Maya, it was helping other communities recognize and fight similar battles. Diana's testimony before federal investigators revealed an even darker pattern. Corporate executives had created a playbook for targeting vulnerable communities, sharing tactics and strategies across companies and states. It was like a franchise, she explained in a closed session. They'd identify elderly homeowners in gentrifying areas, especially in minority communities. Then they'd deploy the same methods we used at Riverside: manipulated tax records, falsified documents, corrupted local officials. The evidence she provided led investigators to a luxury resort in the Cayman Islands, where corporate leaders had held annual meetings to coordinate their efforts. Photos showed James Whitman and other executives celebrating as they planned their next targets. Andre's technical expertise proved crucial in unraveling the digital web of corruption. Working with federal cybercrime units, he developed software to identify manipulated property records and trace patterns of fraud. These companies thought technology would help them hide their crimes, he explained to a congressional committee. Instead, it created a digital trail we could follow right to their doorstep. Major tech companies offered Andre lucrative positions, but he chose to establish his own nonprofit organization, the Ruth Carter Institute for Digital Justice. Its mission? To help marginalized communities protect their property rights through technology and education. My grandmother taught me that knowledge is a shield, he told his team. Now we're going to share that protection with everyone who needs it. The coalition that had started in a church basement was evolving into a national movement. The Carters' legacy became a blueprint for community organizing, with chapters forming in cities across the country. Reverend Samuel traveled to speak at churches nationwide, sharing the story of their struggle and success. What happened in our community wasn't unique, he preached, but our response can be a light for others to follow. Sarah Washington, once too frightened to speak above a whisper, now led training sessions teaching elderly residents how to document and protect their property rights. Fear keeps us silent, she would say. Knowledge gives us power. James Whitman and Judge Harrow faced federal indictments along with dozens of other executives and officials. The evidence trail led to shocking revelations about the depth of corruption in the real estate industry. Bank records revealed kickbacks to local officials in multiple cities. Email chains showed corporate executives joking about urban renewal through attrition as they targeted elderly homeowners. Offshore accounts held millions in profits from their systematic theft. Patricia Whitman, seeking leniency, provided investigators with records of private club meetings where wealthy investors planned gentrification strategies. We called it demographic optimization, she admitted. It was just a fancy term for pushing people out of their homes. The Justice Department's investigation expanded to include major banks that had facilitated the fraud. Loan officers had been instructed to deny refinancing to elderly homeowners while approving predatory developers. The conspiracy wasn't just about stealing land, Maya wrote in her latest article. It was about erasing communities, destroying generational wealth, and rewriting history itself. Diana found redemption in her role as a key witness. Her testimony helped secure indictments against corporate leaders across the country. More importantly, It helped other whistleblowers find the courage to come forward. I carried the guilt of my involvement for years, she shared during a support group for former corporate employees. But Ruth Carter taught us that it's never too late to stand for truth. The coalition's success inspired similar movements globally. Communities in other countries began documenting their own struggles against corporate land theft, creating an international network of resistance and support. Elijah received letters from people around the world, sharing their stories and thanking him for showing that justice was possible. Each one reminded him of Ruth's words about truth being like a seed, planted in one place, and it would grow everywhere. The community center planned for their reclaimed land was becoming a reality. Architects worked with local residents to design a space that would honor the past while serving future generations. Ruth always said our land should be a blessing to others, Elijah told the planning committee. Now it will be. The center would include a legal clinic, technology training facilities, and a museum documenting their struggle. But its heart would be the Ruth Carter Memorial Library, where their story and others like it would be preserved for future generations. Federal investigators discovered that the conspiracy reached into unexpected places. Popular real estate TV shows had been secretly funded by the same corporations, promoting gentrification while hiding its human cost. They created a narrative about revitalizing neighborhoods, Maya's investigation revealed. But they never showed the elderly residents being forced out, the communities being torn apart. Andre's database project evolved into a national early warning system, identifying patterns of corporate targeting before communities could be displaced. Local organizations used this information to help vulnerable residents protect their rights. Technology was their weapon, Andre explained during a TED Talk that went viral. We're turning it into our shield. The Ruth Carter Institute's first major initiative was a free app helping homeowners document and protect their property records. Its launch video featured elderly residents learning to use their phones to photograph documents and store them securely. My grandmother would have loved this, Andre told Maya during an interview. She did everything with paper and photocopies. Now we're helping people create digital versions of her system. Diana's mother, watching the national news coverage from her small apartment, finally understood why her daughter had risked everything to expose the truth. She called Diana for the first time in years. You did what I couldn't, she said through tears. You fought back. The Federal Task Force's preliminary report revealed that over the past decade, corporate land theft had stripped minority communities of billions in generational wealth. The findings sparked congressional hearings and calls for systemic reform. Elijah testified before Congress, bringing Ruth's diary to illustrate how one woman's foresight had helped expose a national conspiracy. His testimony moved several representatives to tears. My wife knew that truth needs guardians, he told the committee. She became one, and now we must all follow her example. The coalition's legal team, working pro bono, began helping similar organizations across the country. They created a template for fighting corporate land theft, sharing strategies that had worked in their case. Sarah Washington's grandson, inspired by their struggle, entered law school with plans to specialize in property rights and elder justice. My grandmother showed me what courage looks like, he said. Now, I want to help protect other families. Maya's investigation uncovered a corporate memo referring to their targeting of elderly homeowners as Project Sunset, a cynical reference to waiting for residents to die or become too tired to fight. They never counted on people like Ruth Carter, Maya wrote. They never understood that some lights refuse to fade. The story of their struggle became required reading in law schools and urban planning programs. Students studied how systematic racism and corporate greed had combined to threaten generations of family wealth. But they also learned about resistance, about the power of community, about one woman's determination to preserve truth for future generations. As the sun set over their reclaimed land, Elijah stood with Andre, watching construction begin on the community center. Ruth's photograph smiled from the billboard announcing the project. Your grandmother knew this day would come, Elijah said softly. That's why she fought so hard to leave us a map to follow. Andre nodded. thinking of all the communities now using his software to protect their own legacies. She planted seeds of justice, he replied. And look how they've grown. 2 years after the landmark court victory, the Ruth Carter Community Center stood proudly on the reclaimed land. Its modern architecture incorporated elements from the original Carter family home, wraparound porches, garden spaces, and wide windows that welcomed sunlight. Above the entrance, Ruth's words were etched in bronze. Truth finds its way to light. Andre Carter walked through the center's bustling halls, now the headquarters of his nonprofit organization. Young people worked at computer stations, helping elderly residents digitize their property records. In the legal clinic, volunteer lawyers provided free consultation to families facing similar battles. We've helped prevent over 300 attempted land grabs this year alone, Andre told a documentary crew following him. The software we developed can detect warning signs months before corporations make their move. The Ruth Carter Institute for Digital Justice had grown beyond its original mission. Teams of programmers, many from the local community, developed new tools to protect vulnerable populations from various forms of financial predation. My grandmother used paper and persistence, Andre explained, touching the framed photograph of Ruth that hung in his office. We're using code and community, but the principle is the same. Knowledge is power, and power must be shared. Maya's book about the case, Truth Like Water, had become a national bestseller. But more importantly to her, it had become a manual for community organizing. Grassroots groups across the country used it to understand and fight corporate exploitation. She sat in her new office at the local paper, surrounded by awards including the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Journalism, but her focus remained on local stories, on the continuing fight for justice in communities like her own. The national attention was important, she told a class of journalism students. But real change happens street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood. That's where the stories are. The federal investigation had led to sweeping indictments. James Whitman and Judge Harrow were serving prison sentences, along with dozens of other executives and corrupt officials. Patricia Whitman had turned state's evidence, providing testimony that exposed similar schemes nationwide. Inside the community center's museum space, displays told the story of their struggle. Ruth's diary occupied a place of honor, its pages digitized so visitors could read her prescient warnings and unwavering determination. Elijah often sat on the center's front porch, just as he had on his family home years ago. Today, he watched a group of school children arrive for a tour, their excited voices carrying across the carefully tended gardens. Mr. Carter. They recognized him from their history lessons. Will you tell us about Miss Ruth? He smiled, patting the bench beside him. The children gathered around, eager to hear the story they'd learned in school from the man who had lived it. Ruth believed in leaving footprints, he began, using the phrase that had become his signature opening. She knew that others would need to follow our path, so she made sure they could see the way. Inside, the center hummed with activity. The technology lab offered free classes for seniors learning to protect their digital assets. The library hosted community meetings and educational programs. The health clinic provided services to elderly residents who might otherwise be vulnerable to predatory practices. Diana, now head of the center's whistleblower support program, counseled former corporate employees seeking redemption through truth-telling. Her mother had become one of her strongest supporters, sharing her own story of loss and resilience. Ruth Carter taught us that it's never too late to choose justice, Diana told her support groups. Every truth shared weakens the walls of corruption. Reverend Samuel's church had become a national training center for community organizing. Religious leaders from across the country came to learn how faith communities could support social justice movements. Brother Carter and Sister Ruth showed us what faith in action looks like, he preached. Not just believing in justice, but working for it, sacrificing for it, preserving truth for those who come after. Sarah Washington, once too afraid to speak up, now led workshops teaching elderly residents their rights. Her gentle manner put people at ease while her hard-won knowledge gave them strength. Fear kept us quiet for so long, she would say, showing people how to document their property records. But Ruth taught us that our voices matter. Our stories matter. Our lives matter. The coalition's success had inspired similar movements worldwide. Community groups from Brazil to South Africa reached out to learn from their experience. Andre's software had been translated into multiple languages, helping vulnerable communities globally protect their rights. The Carter's legacy had grown into a national organization with chapters in every major city. Each group adapted the model to their local needs while maintaining the core principles. Document everything, stand together, and never stop fighting. For justice. James Wilson, now in his 80s, taught gardening classes in the center's community plots. "This land feeds more people now than ever before," he said proudly, showing children how to tend the vegetables their ancestors had grown. Local businesses that had supported the coalition through its darkest days thrived as the community recovered its strength. The neighborhood became a model of sustainable development, proving that progress didn't require displacement. Maya's investigative unit had trained dozens of young journalists in community-centered reporting. Their stories exposed continuing attempts at corporate exploitation while highlighting successful resistance. "It's not enough to expose corruption," she taught them. "We have to show people how to fight it, how to protect themselves, how to build power together." The Ruth Carter Memorial Scholarship, funded by recovered corporate assets, sent local students to law school and journalism programs. Recipients pledged to return and serve their community, ensuring the next generation would have champions. Andre's technology team had expanded to include high school interns learning coding and cybersecurity. Many were children of coalition members, turning their parents' struggle into digital tools for justice. "Every line of code we write," Andre told them, "is a shield protecting someone's grandmother, someone's legacy, someone's future." The federal task force's work had led to new legislation strengthening protections for elderly homeowners and minority communities. Politicians who had once ignored their constituents now faced organized, technologically savvy groups demanding accountability. Elijah received letters daily from people fighting similar battles. He answered each one personally, sharing Ruth's wisdom and the lessons they'd learned. His gentle strength and unwavering dignity inspired others to persist despite setbacks. The community center's walls featured photographs of their struggle, the courthouse protests, the candlelight vigils, the moment of victory. But most prominent was the image of Ruth, smiling with quiet confidence, as if she had always known justice would prevail. On quiet evenings, Elijah would sit in the center's garden, surrounded by flowers Ruth would have loved. The sound of children playing mixed with the voices of elderly residents sharing stories, creating the harmony she had always envisioned. "You were right, my love," he would whisper to her memory. "Truth does find its way. Sometimes it just needs a little help." The center had become more than a building. It was a testament to the power of community, a beacon of hope for others fighting similar battles, a living legacy of one woman's determination to preserve truth for future generations. Diana's mother, visiting the center for the first time, stood long before Ruth's photograph. "She knew," she said softly. "She knew we would all need her strength someday." The Ruth Carter Institute's latest project focused on creating a national database of community resistance strategies. Stories of struggle and success from across the country were collected, digitized, and shared, creating a living history of resistance and resilience. Andre had recently married, choosing to hold the ceremony in the center's garden. During the celebration, he raised a toast to his grandmother's memory. "She taught us that love means fighting for justice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after." Maya's daughter, born during the height of their struggle, took her first steps in the center's playground. She would grow up knowing the story of Ruth Carter, understanding that one person's courage could light the way for many. The center's weekly community dinners brought together elderly residents and young activists, creating bonds that strengthened their continuing work for justice. Stories were shared, strategies discussed, and new alliances formed. Elijah recorded a video message for future generations, to be preserved in the center's archives. Ruth knew that our struggle wasn't just about land, he said. It was about dignity, about memory, about the right to belong somewhere and pass that belonging to your children. As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold, Elijah stood on the center's porch one last time. Children played in the gardens their ancestors had tended. Elderly residents sat in rocking chairs, sharing wisdom with young activists. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Above the entrance, Ruth's words caught the fading light. Truth finds its way to light. Elijah smiled, feeling her presence in every corner of this place they had fought so hard to reclaim. Their struggle had created something beautiful, not just a building, but a living testament to the power of love, truth, and justice. Look, what grew from your seeds, Ruth, he whispered to the evening air. Look what bloomed from your truth. What would you fight for if you knew truth was your shield? What legacy would you protect if you knew justice only needed time to bloom? If this story moved you, remember that similar battles are being fought in communities across America today. Like, subscribe, and share to help these voices be heard, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us. Justice, like truth, always finds its way to light.